Good morning, and welcome to the latest edition of the Christian Recorder Dialogues. I am your host, Chuck Hobbs, and I am very pleased today to have with us Representative Terri Sewell, a fellow AME. Once again, the Christian Recorder Dialogues is a product of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and we are grateful for the AMC Publishing as well as the Christian Recorder, the official news organ of the AME Church. Again, I have with us a woman who has done some extraordinary things over the course of the last 30 some odd years, Representative Terri Sewell. She is a native of Selma, Alabama, where she held the distinction of being the first Black valedictorian of Selma High School. Upon graduation from Selma High School, she attended Princeton University, where she graduated with honors as well. And she published her master's thesis, which was Black Women in Politics, Our Time Has Come. She later went on to Oxford University as a Marshall Fellow, and there she penned a thesis that later became a book, Black Tribunes, Race and Representation in British Politics. Following her tenure in Oxford, she went to Harvard Law School, where she earned her Juris Doctorate, and during the process became friends with someone else you may know well, President Barack Obama. Once she completed her studies as a law student, she clerked for a federal judge in Alabama, and later went on to become one of the top and first Black female public finance lawyers in the state of Alabama. In 2010, she ran for the seat that was vacated when then Representative Archer Davis ran for governor in Alabama. And over the past 10 years, she has served as the only Democrat in the Alabama delegation, representing its 7th congressional district, which includes most of northern Alabama. It is my pleasure to introduce Representative Terri Sewell. Good morning.
Good morning.
What I always start off these dialogues with asking the distinguished guests what role the AME Church in particular has played, or your Christian faith has played, both in your academic background as well as your professional and personal life.
Obviously, you can't be from the Deep South and not have a strong faith. And my church home is the historic Brown Chapel AME Church in Selma, Alabama. And my church family has played such an important foundational role in my life. I'm very blessed to be the product of a PK. My mother grew up in the Primitive Baptist church in Lowndes County, Alabama, where her father, my grandfather, my big daddy, was a pastor of the church, Bulow Primitive Baptist Church in Lowndes County for over 50 years. And before that, his father was. So I come from a great faith tradition, and I feel very honored and blessed that my faith has been really the guiding light for me in times of trouble and in times of blessings. And so I just feel honored to have grown up in the historic Brown Chapel AME Church. My church family, everyone from my Sunday school teachers to singing in the choir, to being an usher. My mom is still very active at Brown Chapel AME Church. And so my AME faith is very important to me. And I just feel very blessed to have such a wonderful, strong foundation in the AME Church.
Speaking of your hometown of Selma, Alabama, that was the center point, obviously, of so many battles of the civil rights movement. And you were born toward the tail end of that movement. And what I want to talk about is growing up in that city. What was that like in regards to the racial climate? You know, I noted at the top of the hour that you were the first Black valedictorian of Selma High School. What was it like growing up there and attending Selma High?
Yeah, I am 3 generations strong from Selma. So my dad and my grandmother, they all grew up in Selma. And obviously my dad's experience, his growing up in segregated Selma in the 1940s and 50s, very different than me growing up in Selma in the 70s and 80s. My parents were both educators. My mom was a high school librarian and my dad was a high school football coach. And they both were the first to integrate the school system in Selma. And so, Selma High School used to be the all white segregated high school, parish high school. And in the 70s, yes, all deliberate speed, Brown versus Board of Education, Selma, like a lot of Deep South cities, took a while for all deliberate speed to integrate those institutions. But my mom was the first Black librarian of the integrated high school. My dad was the first Black basketball coach of the integrated high school. And so, for me, I found growing up in Selma idyllic in many ways. I didn't know anything else, right? So growing up, it's a small tight-knit community. People think of Selma because of the bridge and because of what happened on that bridge, of it being a big city, but it's really a small town of 19,000. I felt nurtured and loved, and I felt very much sheltered in many ways. I couldn't go very far in high school without having my teachers be also members of the church or members of my mom's sorority. So I felt very nurtured, and it was people in Selma who told me that I could be someone. I believed them, and I carried and hold close those relationships, even in my darkest times at Princeton, where I was the first Black valedictorian of Selma High School, but I was also the first person in my school system to ever go to an Ivy League school. And what I found is that I was woefully unprepared in many ways, but I was given a great foundation. The people of Selma, my teachers, told me I was an excellent writer. They gave me the foundational tools to succeed. And if I applied myself and I believed in the Lord above, and if I worked hard, that I could succeed. And it was those tenets of principles that really carried me through my darkest hours. I'd love to say that Princeton gave me an opportunity by admitting me, but the 3.7 that I got at Princeton University, that was on me. And that was really due to the wonderful foundation that I received in Selma. And so I'm very grateful to the wonderful teachers that I had. I had an amazing debate coach. I was able to become a championship debater, which is a reason why I caught the attention of Princeton and other universities. And so, it was a public high school, but they really instilled great foundational tools and tenets to us. And so I feel very blessed to have had that as my base.
Speaking of your tenure at Princeton University, over the past 2 months, I'd say since the death of George Floyd in particular, and we're going to talk a little bit about social justice issues in the wake of several deaths over the last 5 or 6 months. But speaking about Princeton specifically and your experiences coming from the Deep South to attending an Ivy League school and specifically attending Princeton, as you well know, over the last 2 months in particular, there has been a movement of sort with regards to changing the names of different schools or colleges within colleges that are named for individuals who may have been either Confederate leaders or Jim Crow supporters. Princeton, as you well know, was the alma mater of President Woodrow Wilson, and he also served as a professor there. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe he was president of the university.
He was, yeah.
Okay. And there has been a movement with regards to trying to get a greater remove maybe some of his involvement or his name from certain public square honors as well. What are your thoughts with regards to what you're seeing now? Like not just with Princeton and President Wilson, but also in your hometown, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, named for a former Confederate general. There's a movement obviously afoot to try to potentially rename it. What are your thoughts with regards to renaming areas that have honored for well over a century individuals who were complicit in the struggle for Black civil rights?
Well, I think that we really have come in an inflection point in our nation's history. I think that all of the Confederate namings should be on the table, including the renaming of the bridge. When you think about why we have these military bases named after these Confederate generals, a lot of that was about white supremacy and glorifying the Deep South. The fact of the matter is the Confederacy lost. These were traitors. They were people who were fighting against the Republic. And I think that I sit on the board of Princeton University. I'm a board of trustee member of Princeton, and I was very proud to vote to remove the name of Woodrow Wilson, who really continued to keep segregation within the civil ranks when he was president of the United States. And while, Woodrow Wilson did a lot of things like getting us into the League of Nations, which ultimately became the UN, the reality is that now is the time for us to admit that glorifying white supremacy or those that would rather keep us stuck in the dark ages, now is the time that those namings need to be considered and those names need to be removed. The reality is that this moment requires us to be unequivocal. As my niece would say, either you're with us or you're not with us. What are you saying? You can make nuanced arguments about the bridge because, people do believe, and I believe, that the name of that bridge has been transcended by what happened on that bridge with our foot soldiers like John Lewis and what they did. And you can make those nuanced arguments, but I believe that given this movement, and the reality is that we're seeing those coming down, everything should be considered. I believe that the citizens of Selma who have grown up in Selma and understand the complicated history of Selma, of Civil War and civil rights living side by side. Growing up in Selma, every March we would commemorate Bloody Sunday and what happened on that bridge. But come April, there would be the Battle of Selma being recommemorated, which was a Confederate battle. And you grew up knowing that side by side. But I believe that all of those namings glorify days gone by where people wanted to keep people like me and you in our place, and they must go. They are racist symbols of an era of American history that is, thank God, people like John Lewis and foot soldiers marched, prayed, died for the right for us to, and for this nation to live up to its ideals of equality and justice for all, and we need to remove them. I was proud to vote for the National Defense Authorization Bill, which has in it, and Republicans and Democrats came together, giving 3 years to the Department of Defense to remove the names of these Confederate namings of bases, like Fort Bragg's and others that are named after Confederate generals. The time has come for us to put those where they belong in the past.
I totally agree with you. And one of the things that I have found interesting is that part of the argument that has come back from individuals who do not share necessarily the same political ideologies that we do is that, well, it's tradition, it's history, not fully understanding that there was no base named Fort Bragg or Fort Benning until the civil rights movement really began in the early 1940s. A lot of people are not really that aware that those names, as well as the vestiges of Confederate battle flag being placed into state flags, really was something that was fomented by individuals in the Deep South who were being hard-hearted with regards to not wanting to comply with the slow but steady movement toward equal rights under the law. And
absolutely. And when you think about the fact that most of those statutes appear in towns and town centers across the nation, and especially in the Deep South, they were done as a means of making sure that they glorified the Confederacy and remembered. I mean, it was a source of intimidation to African Americans, and they stand today as a vestige of racial discrimination and white supremacy. And, they belong in museums. While I agree that we can't rewrite our history, and the fact that we live in a democracy that is still struggling to fulfill its highest ideals of equality and justice, and it takes the agitation, and as John Lewis would say, the nonviolent agitation of the citizens demanding change, that we get to being a more perfect union. We do, I think, at this moment, must acknowledge that if Black lives matter, if all lives matter, Black lives must matter. And if Black lives matter, then those kinds of vestiges belong in museums and not in city squares. And we shouldn't be glorifying them.
I totally agree. And I also want to harken back to Representative Lewis, the late Representative Lewis, again, passed away last month, and the tributes that poured in for him in the 2 weeks after his death were worthy, obviously, of a man of his stature who did so much to try to make what is put on paper, as Dr. King used to say about the Constitution, a reality. With that in mind, what was it like having grown up in Selma, knowing the history because of, again, your family's own role in that history, knowing who he was, and yet being able to serve in Congress with him for over a decade? What was that like?
All I can say is God bless America, right? I think that it is a true testament to the American dream. I grew up, like I said, in the historic Brown Chapel AME Church. And so I grew up, all of us have our special pew that our family sits in. And I grew up in the church every Bloody Sunday. They would come back. John Lewis, Coretta Scott King, Juanita Abernathy, C.T. Vivian, all of them would come back just to remind us of the importance of what happened on that bridge. It was a source of inspiration. The legend of John Lewis and those foot soldiers was, because I grew up in Selma, was as familiar to me as any Bible verse or any family lore. I grew up in awe of what they did, and having growing up in a house that literally miles from the bridge was a vessel for me to get home to see my parents. But I was always very cognizant of the importance that their sacrifice and their courage meant for America. And of course, I was a direct beneficiary of that movement, as were you, Chuck. All of us are. We owe a debt of gratitude that we can never repay. We understand that the price of freedom was paid for by so many people that we stand on the shoulders of. But to grow up a daughter of Selma, I never in my wildest dreams ever would have imagined that I would become Alabama's first Black Congresswoman. And I know that I get to walk the halls of Congress to this day because of the personal sacrifice of John Lewis, F.D. Reese, Amelia Boynton Robinson. I can go on and on. The Courageous Eight from Selma. There were so many that led the way for us to have the jobs that we all have now, and the opportunities that we have now. But as John would say, every generation has to be vigilant in maintaining the progress of the past and advancing it in the future. And so we all have a role to play. And mine in Congress is trying to fully restore the Voting Rights Act that was gutted by the Supreme Court in 2013 in the Shelby versus Holder decision. I'm honored every day to be the lead sponsor of what we now call the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Act of 2020. And it was only because we went to the polls in 2018 and voted and elected a Democratic majority in the House of Representatives to be a check on the current president that we even have an opportunity to vote on that bill. H.R. 4, the Voting Rights Advancement Act, passed the House of Representatives. It's sitting languishing on Mitch McConnell's desk right now. We renamed it the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Act. And, all of us should go to the polls every election, local, state, and federal. We can all do our part. We stand on the shoulders of these amazing people like John Lewis, and all of us have a role to play. Ours as citizens of this great country is to vote, to fill out that census form. We must be civically engaged, every generation, because progress is elusive. Every generation has to fight to maintain it.
I totally agree with you that progress is elusive. And one of the things that I found interesting that Representative Lewis discussed often, as did many of his brothers and sisters who marched alongside and led alongside him, as well as my own mother and many of her friends who are in that same age group, they lament the fact that here we are in 2020, and many of the battles that they thought were won forever, our generation and the younger generations are fighting again. With regards to the John Lewis Act and the Voting Rights Act in general, does it surprise you that here we are in 2020, and particularly in the Deep South, we are dealing with voter suppression issues that are coming about in different states? What are your thoughts with regards to that?
Well, now more than ever, we need the full protections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Old battles have become new again. We are seeing modern day voter suppression that is just as bad as the days of yore. We may not have to count how many marbles are in a jar or recite how many, the 67 counties in the state of Alabama in order to vote, to register to vote. Those poll taxes and other things were what our forebears had to do. But we still, nevertheless, especially after the gutting of the Voting Rights Act by the Shelby decision in 2013, we've seen 25 states institute more restrictive voter requirements. The state of Alabama changed the types of photo ID, types of IDs that one can show in order to vote. They went from being able to vote through a legitimate federal ID called a Social Security card. Doesn't have a photo on it, but it's a legitimate ID. My dad, who was a 9-time stroke victim towards the end of his life, that's how he voted. All of a sudden now, the state of Alabama is requiring a photo ID. And those states are making choices as to who gets to really vote by the type of ID that they're saying are required. In some states, your gun license is required, is a proper photo ID and not a university license, a university ID. So we're seeing across the states, like in even North Dakota, we saw that they are now requiring you have a physical address in order to go and register to vote, knowing that in Indian country, they don't have physical addresses. They mostly have P.O. boxes. Or we see in North Carolina, they went to try to limit the number of early voting. We see across this nation, we saw in the 2018 election, midterm elections, we saw purging of the rolls in Georgia by the Secretary of State, who was, by the way, running for governor against Stacey Abrams. He won, but it causes into doubt those things. And that would have been because Georgia and Alabama were covered jurisdictions under the Voting Rights Act. Those kinds of changes would have had to be pre-cleared by the Justice Department. Now they don't. I'm really worried about this coming census, which is going to determine how we draw the lines for congressional seats. And for the first time in my lifetime, we won't have the full protections of the Voting Rights Act, which means that state legislatures can draw the lines unfettered by, federal oversight. And that to me is the real danger. So I really hope that we see that old battles have become new again, that this generation will take up the fight for voter equality, for the opportunity for all Americans to have the right to vote as one of their causes. Because if we don't, we're going to see these modern day voter suppression tactics really rule the day.
Yes, ma'am. And one of the hottest political topics over the last week has been whether to mail in vote or whether to try to do early voting and or day of voting at the polls. What is your personal opinion with regards to what our watchers should be doing as we head closer to November? Is it better to go ahead and mail in the ballots, or can we trust that process, so to speak, that number one, it will get in on time, and then number two, that votes from a mail-in absentee perspective will actually be counted?
Well, obviously, we're in the middle of a global pandemic, and states throughout the nation, you're safer to vote from home. And so if you can vote from home, you should do that. What I'm urging my constituents to do is to educate yourself on your state's requirements for absentee balloting. The state of Alabama requires that you make an application. And so you have to know the deadlines of when registration in your state ends to voter registration. Know how you go about mailing in your ballot. In the state of Alabama, they're waiving the excuse requirement because we're in the pandemic, but they're not waiving the photo ID requirement. So it's a two-step process for the state of Alabama. You have to apply for an absentee ballot. And then once you get your absentee ballot, you have to turn it in and it has to be witnessed by two people. That's really hard in the middle of a pandemic. I think that I fully support the Democrats' efforts. Speaker Pelosi Another strong AME person, our Whip Clyburn, the majority whip, Jim Clyburn from South Carolina, has a bill called Vote Safe Act of 2020, which would let every state do a mail-in ballot. Of course, that's stuck on Mitch McConnell's desk, but I think that we now more than ever, you have to know what your state specific requirements are, and that all of us have a plan to vote. I think it's important that we have in-person voting, but we saw that in states like Kentucky, they limited the in-person voting to one polling station per county. And in large cities like Louisville, Kentucky, only having one polling station open, and that polling station only open till 6 p.m. We saw long lines wrapped around. That's modern day voter suppression. The reality is that we must make it easier for people to vote. And until we can get federal oversight reinstated, it's incumbent upon every American to know how they're going to vote in this upcoming presidential election. It's life or death in so many instances. I think we're safer voting from home, but each person must know what their state requirements are, those deadlines, and meet those deadlines and meet that challenge, knowing how they're going to vote this November.
And speaking of the coronavirus, before we went on air earlier, we talked a little bit about this pandemic and the federal response, particularly the Trump administration from a federal level, and then obviously the differing responses in each of the states. What is your critique with regards to how the federal government has responded, both from a science health standpoint, as well as from the standpoint of trying to ameliorate the conditions that so many out of work Americans or Americans who are underinsured or uninsured are facing at this time?
Well, if I had to give this administration a grade on how well they're doing in establishing a national strategy to mitigate against coronavirus and get us through this pandemic, I would give them an F plus, if I could. The reality is that the Trump administration did not recognize the severity of this pandemic early on, has not given us a roadmap to a national strategy of how to get through this. So we're really stuck with how state governors and cities have been able to weather it. And I'm proud of the fact that I have in our first Black mayor in Montgomery, the mayor Woodfin in Birmingham. I'm proud of my mayors for stepping up to the plate and trying to offer that leadership, because it has been void on the federal level by this administration. I'm also proud of what we in the House have been doing. We have led the effort on making sure that we pass the CARES Act, which has provided testing and contact tracing and food nutrition and given our states the resources they need to fight this coronavirus. Proud of what we see in governors like Governor Cuomo in New York, and even our governor, Alabama. She's slow to the uptake, but has really stepped up and instituted most recently a statewide public mask order that we wear masks. Our people, the African-American population, has been disproportionately affected by the coronavirus. We're the ones who are dying and at much bigger rates than we are in the population. We make up slightly more than 13% of the population in the United States, but we're over half of the deaths, and in some cities, 70% of the deaths. In the state of Alabama, we're 26% of the population, but we're 40% of the confirmed cases and 45% of the deaths. It's unacceptable. And so literally, it's local leadership that has made the difference. And I'm proud that the Democrats have really led the effort on the CARES Act with a $2 trillion response, immediately getting money out. In the state of Alabama, we were one of the 14 states that did not expand Medicaid. We're seeing long unemployment lines, and people really need help. And so it's unacceptable that this administration allowed the federal pandemic unemployment insurance of $600 a week to expire July 31st. We're working every day. I'm on phones phone call after phone call in negotiations trying to get this administration to extend the pandemic unemployment insurance. They think that people don't want to work, that it's a disincentive, when I know it's a lifeline for so many people that I represent. The Trump administration wants to begin the dialogue for further relief by talking about liability immunity for corporations. That's the only reason why many of the manufacturing and businesses are even doing mitigation, is because of the fear of liability. If we take that away, it really just will mean that so many of us will be very vulnerable. And so, all I can say is that we continue to work tirelessly to try to make sure that we're closing the gaps on testing, that we're contact tracing, that we're providing nutritional assistance. Now that schools are reopening, that we make sure that our school systems have the PPE that they need, that they have the broadband that they need, the connectivity that they need, that our children are being able to learn from home better. We are in the middle of a global pandemic, and this administration has done nothing but be, this administration and this president has really failed us when it comes to a national strategy.
Representative Sewell, do you believe it's wise for public schools to reopen in the next few weeks? I know that again is another one of those political hot potatoes, but I have always found it curious that the same individuals who are pushing for the reopening of schools are making those pushes via Zoom, StreamYard, distance meetings, and yet here we are on the precipice of a new school year, and we have many of our fellow Americans who are consider themselves to be conservatives who are screaming for the schools to be reopened. Do you think that is the wisest course of action right now, or do you believe that the schools should remain a distance learning option should remain for the time being as we continue to try to flatten the coronavirus curve?
Well, I do recognize that one size doesn't fit all. I know that I have had a series of calls with my superintendents, and I think that it depends upon how the spread is going on in that community, and how that community is faring as to whether or not they should open up. Clearly, the criteria has to be the health and safety and well-being of the students and the faculty and those in that school system. That has to be paramount. And so I am seeing a lot of my minority school districts still do virtual. They've elected to do virtual. Some school systems in the state of Alabama, because our universities and college football is so important, are still seeing our athletics going on. I think that everyone needs to be cautious about that. We should be guided by the science, guided by the statistics and the facts that are going on in those communities. And we have to be guided by the fact that we're still in the middle of this pandemic, that it's disproportionately affecting African Americans, and we must proceed with caution and being guided by the science.
Do you believe that part of the reason that certain states, particularly my state here in Florida, Georgia, which is governed by the aforementioned Brian Kemp, do you believe that race played a role with regards to those states opening up quicker than maybe they should have? Particularly, I'm mentioning when the report started to come out, maybe in early April, that Blacks were disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus, as well as the Latino community. Do you believe that on some level, the rush to then say, hey, let's hurry up and reopen may have stemmed from the fact that most of those governors, their core constituents are not Blacks or Latinos, so therefore they were more concerned about getting back open to make sure that the economy is on a better footing? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, look, I think that they were guided by the pocketbook, right? By the economics of it. I don't know. I mean, I think that they were more worried about opening up quickly this because of the effects that the public health crisis has on our economy. But all of us want to make sure that we have jobs, and the plummeting unemployment affects all of us. But we have to reopen not just safely, but responsibly and strategically. And that just didn't occur across many areas. And clearly, the fact that it disproportionately affected African Americans, and that wasn't the majority of the population in those states, may have means that the impact of them opening up so irresponsibly and so quickly has disproportionately fallen on our communities and communities of color. It's going to be important for us to be our own best public health advocate. No one's going to care about our communities more than we care about our communities, and we're going to have to roll up our sleeves and do what we can to help our communities get over this very serious public health crisis. The Black church will be important in that endeavor. We saw with a lot of the nutrition assistance, the federal assistance that been given out. We've seen our churches really step up with feeding programs, administering the farm to table USDA food distribution. So many churches throughout the AME church, as well as across the board, have really come in and fill those gaps. Once again, we're going to have to circle our communities and be ever vigilant in being our best health advocate.
Representative Sewell, we may be hours, if not days, away from a decision by Vice President Joe Biden on a running mate for this coming November. Okay. Now, he has stated previously that he has a preference to select a woman. There has been a lot of push in the media as well as on social media that the vice president should select a Black woman. What are your general thoughts with regards to the gender of Vice President Biden's potential running mate? And what are your thoughts with regards to whether a Black woman should be the running mate for Mr. Biden?
Well, listen, I think that the Black vote has been so important to the Democratic Party, and Black women have really been the base of the Democratic Party. And now more than ever, I think that the fact that Joe Biden has indicated that he will definitely choose a woman. And I am proud of the deep bench that we have in female leadership in our party and throughout this nation. I am especially proud of the deep bench of African American women that he has to choose from. And I think that he should choose an African American woman. And I'm sure that because of that deep bench and the fact that so many of my dear friends and colleagues are being considered, that he has so many great women, Black women, to choose from, that he will make the right choice for himself in this nation. There is a clear contrast in leadership between President Trump and Vice President Biden. Now more than ever, I think, I know that the church is nonpartisan, but I'm not. I'm a Democrat, and I truly believe that the Democratic ticket will be strengthened by an African American woman being added to the ticket with Joe Biden. And I believe that now more than ever is an opportunity for us to show our strength throughout this nation and get out and vote. This election, every election is important, but this election is particularly important when we think about the fact that the next president will have to guide us through this global pandemic and be on the other side. Joe Biden has shown himself to be a friend of our community, the African American community, the Black church in particular, over the years, both as a senator and as the vice president under the Obama administration. I believe that he has a track record, a proven track record that will only be complemented by an African American woman as his running mate. And I look forward to that announcement soon. And I look forward to rolling up my sleeves and doing all that I can to promote that ticket, because I do believe that we must go to the polls, as John Lewis says, and vote like our lives depend on it, because our lives do depend on it.
Absolutely. And toward that end, Representative Sewell, when you, let's say we do win, by we, I am partisan myself. I am a staunch Democrat. And let's say the Biden, whoever ticket wins in November. When we get there in January, the country obviously has gone through a number of changes over this year, not just with coronavirus, but in regards to social justice. It has been somewhat of a surprise to me to see the multiracial protests that have been sustained since George Floyd's murder this past May. And yet, and still, almost every week, we're continuing to see a person of color who loses their lives based upon the reckless and or murderous decision of a law enforcement officer. With regards to that, a potential Biden administration, what do you foresee moving forward with regards to a federal response to the lingering problem with law enforcement killing unarmed citizens, regardless of race? That continues to be a major problem in America. How can the federal government best address that, both in the White House as well as in Congress?
Well, we in Congress passed 6 weeks ago the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. The Congressional Black Caucus led that initiative for House Democrats, and we put forth a bold and comprehensive package of police accountability and police transparency that's in that act. That act not only would ban chokeholds, it would ban no-knock warrants, which was the reason why Breonna Taylor was killed. It would establish a registry, a federal registry of police misconduct, so that bad actors can't go from jurisdiction to jurisdictions unanswered. It would also give federal grants to communities to reimagine public safety, to be able to refund community best practices when it comes to mental health, when it comes to domestic abuse, when it comes to reimagining public safety in our own communities. It would also make lynching a federal hate crime. These are many bills that time and time again, members of the Congressional Black Caucus have led and have introduced into Congress after Congress. As you rightfully say, this issue of police accountability and unarmed Black men and women being killed at the hands of the police is unique to our community. When you think of the fact that African Americans are 3 times more likely than whites to be killed at the hands of the police, and 1.5 times during those times, so over half of those times, it's an unarmed Black woman or female that's killed. It's unacceptable. And if Black lives matter, then if all lives matter, then Black lives must matter. And in this particular incident on police accountability, we have got to do something. I was moved to see the 26 days of unstopped protests across this nation, across this world, frankly, in solidarity with the movement after George Floyd's killing. We watched as this man, 8 minutes and 46 seconds, that this police officer had his knee on his neck. And we watched the life be sucked out of this man. And we have got to do something about it. I'm really worried that if this generation who actively, righteously protested on the streets of America for police accountability, we owe it to this generation to make sure that there's a linkage between their righteous indignation and their, protests on the streets and meaningful legislative change. Congress passed, the House of Representatives 6 weeks ago passed the George Floyd Act. It sits on the Senate. The Senate did their own bill, a watered down version. And now we are at an impasse. It's unacceptable. I know that one of the first acts of a Biden administration in the presidency would be to put across the finish line the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And I look forward to rolling up my sleeves and making sure that that does happen. Along with the Congressional Black Caucus, we make sure that we have a federal response worthy of dealing with police accountability and transparency. Our lives matter, and only we can make sure that that continues to be on the forefront. Change rarely comes from the halls of Congress without kinetic grassroots community activism and engagement. And we saw that, we heard that, we see you, we hear that, and we must push for that change on the federal level.
Representative Sewell, on behalf of Reverend Roderick Beelan of AMEC Publishing and Christian Recorder editor John Thomas, I'd like to thank you so much for taking some time out of your busy schedule to speak with us today. And we are hopeful that we will be able to talk to you some more later this fall or after the fall elections finish. And we wish you all the best and Godspeed. Also, yes, ma'am. Thank you so much.
I want to say in closing, let's all remember John Lewis, not by words, but by deeds. Let's remember to go out and vote in every election. This August, we'll see lots of municipalities have their own elections. And then, of course, this fall, November, the presidential election. In closing, I just want us to remember John Lewis's closing words. He came stricken with cancer to the 55th anniversary of the march from Selma to Montgomery. And on that bridge, he said, never give up, never give in. We must keep the faith. We must keep our eyes on the prize. And we must remember that our vote is our voice, and never let our voice be silenced in any election. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. God bless. And we'd like to thank you, the watchers and listeners. And we want to let you know that we have several great shows coming up on Monday, August 10th. Tune in to TCR Dialogues, where Reverend Dr. Rosalind Satchel will be interviewed by journalist Lauren Wilson. And we also have my Morehouse brother and editor, Mr. John Thomas, who will be interviewing the Reverend Dr. Dennis Dickerson on Wednesday, August the 19th. Thank you so much for coming and for listening. God bless.